May 15th, 1943. The heat in Texas rolled over the earth like an iron pressing a shirt flat, and the men who stepped off the train felt its weight immediately. They were German soldiers, prisoners of war taken from North Africa, their desert uniforms, still coated with dust and sweat, though now their collars sagged and their boots clattered without pride. Their faces were thin from weeks in transit, and in their eyes lived a mixture of suspicion, exhaustion, and curiosity. They expected barbed wire and rifles, perhaps beatings, certainly hunger. What they did not expect was the sound of birdsong. Overhead, the smell of cut grass drifting through the air, and rows of wooden barracks that looked more like summer camps than prisons. American guards stood watch, rifles slung casually, but they were not barking orders. One of them even tilted his hat against the sun and grinned as if the Germans were no more dangerous than stray cattle arriving at the stockyard. That grin unsettled them more than shouted threats would have. War had taught them to brace for cruelty, not casual indifference. The camp gates opened with a squeal of hinges, and inside, the POWs were marched to their quarters. Barbed wire fenced the perimeter, but within that circle the world was strangely ordinary. Wooden barracks lined a central path, a mess hall sat at one end, and behind it stood a squat building whose purpose no one immediately guessed. One prisoner, a farm boy from Bavaria, muttered to the man beside him that it looked like a chicken coop. Another joked, "Maybe it's where they keep the dogs they'll set on us." They laughed nervously, each word masking fear. As the guards showed them the inside of the barracks, the prisoners noticed neat rows of bunks, mattresses filled with cotton, even blankets folded at the foot. Sunlight streamed through windows with glass panes, something rare in rural Germany where many homes still had shutters but no glass at all. On a table sat a pitcher of water. The men exchanged glances. One whispered, "It's cleaner than my schoolhouse back home." The guard, overhearing, gave a half smile but said nothing. The real shock came when they were herded toward the washroom. A door swung open and the smell of disinfectant mixed with soap hit their noses. Lined against the wall, white porcelain toilets gleamed under electric light. Beside them stood sinks with shining faucets. The prisoners froze, staring as though they had entered a shrine rather than a restroom. One leaned forward, touching the porcelain, running his calloused fingers along its smoothness. Another tapped, the chrome handle, unsure if it was metal or some trick material. When a guard motioned for them to use it, the first prisoner sat gingerly, eyes darting around as if expecting laughter. Then came the decisive moment. The flush. A pull of the handle, a sudden roar of water, a swirl, and the waste vanished. The man leapt back, startled, and the others erupted into murmurs. They lined up eagerly, each determined to see for himself the miracle. One flushed again and again, laughing, shaking his head in disbelief. Another cupped his hands in the bowl of the sink, gasping as clean water poured freely with a simple twist of the tap. To men who had grown up with outhouses and shared village pumps, this was sorcery made practical. American guards leaned against the wall, amused. Later, one wrote in a letter home, "You'd think we'd given them gold the way they crowded those toilets. I swear some of them forgot they were prisoners." Another quipped, "If Hitler had given them plumbing like this, maybe they'd have fought harder." The humor was dry, but beneath it lay an awareness. These men were encountering not weapons, but the quiet power of American modernity. The prisoners talked among themselves long after they returned to the barracks. They compared memories of home, outhouses that froze in winter, chamber pots emptied into manure heaps, water carried in buckets from wells. They whispered about the toilets as if they were treasure. One remarked, "If even prisoners live like this here, what must the free people have?" The question lingered in the silence, heavier than any rifle butt or chain. That night, as the cicadas hummed and the camp lights flickered on, a few men sat awake, staring at the ceiling. They had been raised on propaganda that painted America as corrupt, chaotic, and weak, Yet here they were, treated not with cruelty but with a cleanliness that felt almost dignified. It was a contradiction too sharp to ignore. They had been captured as enemies, but within hours they were discovering comforts that many had never known in their own homes. The camp itself was no paradise. Barbed wire and watchtowers reminded them constantly of their captivity. Meals were simple: beans, bread, sometimes meat, but always filling. Work details waited for them in the fields and sawmills. Yet even amid confinement, the ordinary American standard of living seemed to shine through like light under a door. And of all things, it was the toilet that became the symbol of that revelation. A swirl of water represented a society where convenience had triumphed over hardship, where the mundane was transformed into marvel. The Americans had not planned this as psychological warfare. They had built camps to meet Geneva Convention standards and to reflect their own military routines. But inadvertently, they had offered a window into a different world. For German prisoners, that world was unsettling precisely because it was so ordinary. In their minds, they turned over the implications. If America gave flush toilets to its captives, what did it give to its children? To its workers? To its farmers? The answers gnawed at them in ways no interrogation could. One prisoner, a tall man from Saxony, later told a fellow captive, "I have seen the enemy's strength, and it is not in tanks or planes. It is in the way they live when they are not at war." His words spread quietly, repeated in bunks, mess lines, and work crews. It was not admiration yet, nor surrender, but the seed of a different perspective. War had defined America as an opponent. Plumbing was teaching them it was also a phenomenon. As days passed, the toilets became a running joke. Some men boasted of how many times they flushed in one visit. Others speculated about underground rivers feeding the endless water. Humor lightened their captivity, but beneath it was awe. These machines had turned their assumptions upside down. They had expected brutality and found instead a swirl of water that carried more meaning than any soldier could explain. The guards, half amused and half bewildered, let them marvel. They knew the prisoners' astonishment was harmless, perhaps even useful. In later years, historians would note that these small encounters with American daily life did more to challenge Nazi propaganda than any lecture or pamphlet. The toilet became a symbol, not of defeat, but of exposure to a world that worked differently, quietly undermining the stories they had been told. The sun set on that first day, casting long shadows across the camp. Inside the barracks, tired men finally drifted to sleep, but not without one last murmur. "Tomorrow, I'll try the handle again." The words carried both humor and longing, as if the porcelain fixtures had become a promise that the world was larger, stranger, and perhaps kinder than they had imagined. And though they did not yet realize it, the shock of that discovery was only the beginning. For in the days ahead, the toilets would prove to be merely the first of many revelations, each one unsettling their beliefs more than the last. Morning. Inside the camp began not with the bark of a guard, but with the clang of a bell, echoing across the yard as the sun spilled over the barracks. German prisoners stirred from bunks, rubbing eyes still heavy with fatigue, the smell of wood and dust clinging to their blankets. Outside, dew clung to the grass, and sparrows flitted along the barbed wire. To men who had braced themselves for brutality, the rhythm felt disarmingly calm. It was captivity, yes, but captivity shaped by routine rather than terror. They filed into the mess hall, where tin trays slid across counters, filled with eggs, potatoes, and sometimes even bacon. The rations astonished them. Many had left behind. Families in Germany who lived on thin soups and dark bread cut thinner each week under Allied blockade. Here, prisoners ate the same calories allotted to American soldiers, 3,000 a day, balanced and sufficient. Some men whispered that they were eating better in Texas than their wives and children in Saxony or Bavaria. Guilt mixed with Gratitude as they sat at long wooden tables, chewing in silence, heads bowed more in disbelief than in prayer. After breakfast, details were organized for work. Groups marched out under the watch of armed guards, though the rifles rarely left their shoulders. They worked in cotton fields, repaired roads, or cut timber for local mills. Farmers nearby often requested POW labor, finding the Germans efficient and disciplined. In return, the men were given small wages in camp scrip, enough to buy tobacco, candy, or even razor blades at the camp canteen. The irony was not lost on them. As prisoners, they had access to goods scarcer than what their families could find in Germany's markets. But the true wonder of daily life remained in the amenities. The toilets, though no longer shocking, had become a symbol of status, almost a sacred object. Men joked about visiting the throne, though beneath the humor lingered genuine awe. The showers, too, were marvels. Hot water streamed from pipes with the turn of a handle, washing away sweat and dust in seconds. One soldier, a former miner from the Ruhr, confessed in a letter home that he had bathed more in 2 weeks of captivity than in the previous 2 years of war. Cleanliness itself became a kind of quiet dignity, reminding them that they were treated as human beings, not beasts. Evenings carried a strange duality. The sting of wire and guard towers contrasted with unexpected comforts. The camp had a library stocked with English and German books donated by churches and universities. Newspapers were delivered, carefully censored but still full of news. Some camps even had theaters where prisoners staged plays, or orchestras formed from men who once played in cafes back home. On summer nights, music drifted across the yard, mingling with the hum of cicadas. It was captivity, yet infused with a softness no one had foreseen. Still, unease lingered beneath the surface. These men were enemies of America, sworn soldiers of the Reich. Some clung fiercely to loyalty, wearing defiance like armor. They painted swastikas in hidden corners, whispered songs of the fatherland, and sneered at the supposed decadence of their captors. Yet others found their convictions fraying, undone not by propaganda or interrogation, but by the sight of everyday abundance. Flush toilets, steaming showers, well-fed bodies. These became arguments stronger than speeches. A Bavarian corporal confided to his bunkmate, "If this is what they give their prisoners, how much must they give their own?" The question cut like a blade through the silence. Letters arriving from home deepened the contrast. Families described nights spent in cellars during bombing raids, the wail of sirens, the collapse of cities into rubble. Children grew thin on ration cards worth less each month. Yet here, across an ocean, German soldiers ate full meals and laughed over card games under electric lights. The dissonance pressed on them, an invisible weight. They were supposed to hate their captors, but daily life made hatred harder to sustain. American guards noticed the change. Some prisoners carried themselves with more ease, even joked with sentries in broken English. Others wrestled with shame, torn between relief at their treatment and loyalty to a crumbling homeland. A guard once wrote in his diary, "We beat them in battle, but comfort is what bends them." It was not triumph in combat, but the sight of a porcelain handle, a steady meal, a warm shower that unsettled their convictions. Even the smallest routines took on symbolic power. At dusk, prisoners queued at sinks, water streaming from faucets without effort. They splashed their faces, combed their hair, and stared into cracked mirrors. For some, it was vanity. For others, it was proof they remained civilized men despite defeat. The camp was a paradox. Barbed wire confined them, yet modern conveniences expanded their sense of what life could be. It was imprisonment wrapped in a strange kind of mercy. Occasionally, humor surfaced in unexpected ways. One afternoon, a group of prisoners smuggled a frog into the washroom and flushed it, curious to see where it would emerge. The guards, half amused and half exasperated, scolded them for mischief. Another time, a prisoner flushed his cap just to prove to his comrades that the water could swallow more than waste. The cap vanished, never seen again, and for days men chuckled that it was probably floating toward Mexico. These moments of levity did not erase the reality of captivity, but they softened its edge, yet shadows remained. Rumors spread of harsher camps elsewhere, of prisoners in Europe facing brutal winters and thin rations. The men in Texas wondered if their own comfort was an illusion, a mask to hide darker intentions. Some whispered that the Americans treated them well only to break their spirit. Others countered that kindness itself was a weapon, sharper than cruelty. Divisions formed quietly, loyalty to the Reich tugging one way, the evidence of daily life tugging the other. In the mess hall, in the barracks, in the endless discussions beside bunks, the question deepened. What did these small mercies mean? For many, the toilets remained at the center of that question. The swirl of water had become more than function. It was metaphor. Every flush seemed to wash away certainty. Every twist of a faucet dissolved a little of the propaganda that had painted America as weak and corrupt. The enemy's strength was not merely in armies, but in infrastructure, in ordinary comforts made universal. Captivity, they began to realize, was revealing truths the battlefield had hidden. As weeks turned to months, the rhythm of life in the camp grew familiar, but familiarity did not blunt its strangeness. A Saxon soldier summed it up in a whisper to his comrade. "They have conquered us with plumbing." The words were half jest, half confession. For in their hearts, they understood something irreversible. They had been defeated not only in battlefields abroad, but in the very idea of how life could be lived. And though they would not yet admit it openly, the flush of porcelain had already begun to change them. But if plumbing and comfort unsettled their loyalties, the next revelation would strike even deeper. For beyond the toilets and showers, beyond the meals and music, lay another shock, one that would challenge not only their bodies, but their beliefs about the world itself. The longer the prisoners remained behind wire, the clearer it became that the flush toilets were not merely conveniences, but symbols. They represented something larger, a vision of society that could afford to make cleanliness and comfort ordinary even for its enemies. For men raised in villages where winter nights meant dashing to outhouses across frozen yards, the very idea of porcelain and running water spoke of another world. At first the men laughed, joking that America fought its wars with plumbing. But in quiet moments, they admitted to each other that the pipes and faucets gnawed at their certainty, a steady drip wearing down stone. Letters from home sharpened the contrast. Families wrote of blackout curtains, ration cards, and air raid sirens. Bombs fell on Hamburg, Essen, Cologne, and Berlin, leaving craters where neighborhoods once stood. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching children as the ground shook. In one letter smuggled through censors, a wife described walking 2 miles to fetch a bucket of water after the local pump was destroyed in an air raid. The prisoner who read it wept silently, then returned to the barracks bathroom, staring at the faucet that poured water with the turn of a hand. The contradiction was unbearable. His family dug for water in rubble. He, a prisoner, had more than he dared to imagine. The Americans had no intention of waging psychological war through plumbing, yet that is precisely what unfolded. Every convenience whispered that the world outside the wire was built on foundations more durable than slogans. A Bavarian corporal, once a proud believer in the Reich, confided to his bunkmates that he could not stop thinking about the irony. The Führer promised glory, but here we sit with more dignity as captives than our families have as free citizens. His words lingered in the dim barracks air like smoke, difficult to dispel. Still, loyalty did not die easily. Among the prisoners, divisions formed. Hardliners insisted that the Americans' generosity was deception, bait to weaken their spirit. They scrawled swastikas in hidden corners, whispered anthems after lights out, and spoke of honor. To them, the toilets were tricks, not truths. Yet others could not deny what their senses told them. Each flush, each hot shower, each meal without rationing pressed them toward an uncomfortable question. If this is how the enemy treats captives, what does that say about the society we serve? Statistics added weight to their doubts. The men heard from Red Cross visitors that by 1940, most American homes already had indoor plumbing, while half of German households still relied on outhouses or communal wells. Even in cities, many apartments shared toilets on landings or in courtyards. America's average life seemed to exceed Germany's ordinary. The numbers, stripped of propaganda, spoke with quiet authority. A guard once quipped to a prisoner, "Here even farmers have bathtubs." The man scoffed aloud, but that night he whispered to his bunkmate, "If that is true, then we were blind." Daily life provided endless reminders. The camp library offered books about America, filled with images of suburban houses, kitchens gleaming with appliances, children playing in gardens with sprinklers. To the prisoners, these photographs looked like postcards from fantasy. The contradictions stung. Germany, with its centuries of history and culture, was crumbling under bombs, while a nation younger than some of their cathedrals provided such luxuries to ordinary families. They had been told America was decadent, morally rotten, and destined to collapse under its own weakness. Yet the evidence swirled in every toilet bowl, clicked in every electric light, steamed from every showerhead. One prisoner, a school teacher before the war, wrestled with the contradiction in letters to his brother. "They call this the land of cowboys," he wrote, "but I tell you even the cowboys must live better than professors at home." His tone was not admiration but bewilderment. The world he saw did not match the world he had been taught to imagine. Truth seeped in through cracks no guard could seal. Humor softened the edges of doubt. Some men called the toilets white miracles and teased one another about who flushed most. Others joked that America's secret weapon was soap, not Sherman tanks. A guard overheard them once and laughed, replying, "Soap lasts longer than bullets." The men chuckled, but later, lying awake, they wondered if the guard's words carried a truth deeper than jest. As weeks turned to months, the toilets and showers became less novelty and more metaphor. They symbolized not only modernity, but also a society that invested dignity even in the least deserving. The contradiction cut sharpest here. The Reich exalted its warriors, yet left many of its civilians in filth and hunger. America fought those warriors, yet gave them porcelain thrones. The irony was almost unbearable. The conflict tore silently at the men. Some clung tighter to ideology, muttering that comfort meant nothing without honor. Others softened, writing home with strange nostalgia for camp life, careful never to reveal too much lest censors cut their words. A few admitted openly that they dreaded returning to Germany, fearing they would leave behind not chains but conveniences. "Better to be a prisoner here than free in ruins," one man whispered, earning glares from hardliners who accused him of betrayal. But the seed had been planted. Guards sensed the divisions and quietly encouraged the cracks. They treated the men fairly, sometimes even sharing cigarettes or stories. They knew that kindness undermined propaganda more effectively than threats, and the toilets unintentionally became their allies. The prisoners could dismiss lectures and resist leaflets, but they could not ignore the swirl of water disappearing with each pull of a handle. The sound itself became a drumbeat of contradiction. In the evenings, as music drifted from the camp orchestra, some prisoners found themselves thinking less of victory and more of plumbing. They wondered what their children would grow up to expect. What kind of homes would rise from the rubble of their cities? They imagined returning to Germany and describing flush toilets, sinks, showers, all ordinary in America but wondrous at home. A few spoke of it as a dream to carry back, a vision of what post-war life might demand. Yet the contradiction cut two ways. For every man softened by comfort, another stiffened in suspicion, convinced that the Americans were manipulating them. "They are fattening us like pigs," one said, "before slaughter." Fear twisted kindness into threat, and doubt became a battlefield as fierce as any fought with guns. The flush toilets, symbols of civilization, also became symbols of dissonance. They revealed a world too different to reconcile easily, and that revelation gnawed at the prisoner's sense of self. The war outside the wire raged on. News of Stalingrad, of Allied bombings, of advances in Italy filtered through, reminding the men that they were part of a collapsing empire. Inside, the porcelain fixtures whispered of another world, one they could not dismiss. Each man carried the contradiction within himself. A war fought in silence beneath the drone of cicadas and the steady hum of American order, And then came the realization that unsettled them most. These were not luxuries displayed for propaganda. This was ordinary life, ordinary enough that even prisoners, sworn enemies, were granted it. What then did ordinary mean for Americans beyond the fences? That question spread like fire through dry grass, unanswerable yet impossible to ignore. And the more they asked it, the more they sensed that the greatest shock still lay ahead. When the war ended and the gates of the camps opened, the prisoners walked out not as conquering heroes, but as men carrying strange memories. They boarded ships under gray skies, sailing back across the Atlantic to a Germany they hardly recognized. Cities were flattened, villages scarred, families thinned by hunger and bombs. Yet alongside their duffel bags and worn uniforms, they carried stories of hot showers, electric lights, meals without rationing, and most curiously of all, toilets that flushed with a pull of a handle. For many, that memory would become the most vivid symbol of their captivity, both humiliating and strangely hopeful. Some wrote about it openly, others whispered, fearing mockery. One former prisoner, returning to a village where outhouses still leaned crooked behind barns, tried to describe what he had seen. Neighbors laughed, calling him gullible as if plumbing could win wars. But he insisted, shaking his head, that the Americans lived differently. So differently that even prisoners had more dignity than free men here. Another told his children, years later, that the first time he flushed a toilet in Texas, he realized Germany had already lost. The war was not only fought with tanks and planes, but with pipes, pumps, and the quiet machinery of everyday life. Historians sometimes downplay such details, but among the men themselves, the memory never faded. A swirl of water became shorthand for a society that seemed wealthier, cleaner, more efficient. It haunted them as they rebuilt their homes. In bombed-out cities, where rubble still smoked and streets stank of waste, the memory of American restrooms stood as an invisible benchmark. Some men admitted they dreamed of it during the hardest days of Reconstruction, longing not for grandeur but for the dignity of sanitation. Ironically, captivity had introduced them to an aspiration. There was guilt, too. Letters had told them of families digging wells amid ruins, of children clutching tin cups for ladles of water. Meanwhile, they had leaned over sinks, twisting faucets that never ran dry. The contradiction cut deep. Some confessed to feeling ashamed that they had lived so cleanly while their families suffered in filth. Others defended themselves, insisting that prisoners had no choice, that survival in captivity was no betrayal. But the irony lingered, a wound healed yet tender. American guards, long after the war, recalled those days with wry smiles. One wrote in his memoir that the Germans never forgot the toilets, as if plumbing had left a greater impression than prison fences. He chuckled that the strongest soldiers of Hitler's army had been undone not by bullets, but by porcelain. Yet beneath the humor lay a truth he recognized. The everyday abundance of America had spoken more powerfully than any weapon. Even enemies could not help but notice. The legacy spread in quieter ways. When West Germany rose from rubble in the 1950s, modernization became a national project. New apartments were built with bathrooms inside, water heaters installed, sanitation improved. Some who had been POWs whispered that they pushed for these changes because they had seen what life could be. They never credited the camps directly, but memory guided their demands. What once felt like luxury in Texas became expectation in Frankfurt, Munich, and Cologne. The swirl of water had crossed the ocean in memory, planting seeds in Reconstruction. Yet irony shadowed every recollection. These men had marched into war under banners of superiority, told they belonged to a master race destined to rule. And yet they had stood in awe before a toilet. Captivity had turned their beliefs upside down, humbling them with the most mundane of symbols. Some laughed about it later, telling grandchildren that they had been conquered by plumbing. But beneath the laughter was an admission. The Reich had failed to deliver even what America gave to its enemies. It was a bitter truth, softened only by the passage of years. The memory also bound them together. In reunions decades later, old soldiers met and told stories of Texas, Louisiana, and Arizona camps. They spoke of hot meals, of orchestras, of guards who shared cigarettes. And inevitably, someone mentioned the toilets. Laughter rose, but it was not only amusement, it was recognition, the shared experience of a cultural shock too strange to forget. They knew it was absurd to define captivity by plumbing, yet they could not deny the weight of that first astonishment. It had been the sound of defeat rendered in porcelain. For some, the toilets became symbols of America itself. They represented excess, power, and a confidence so deep it could afford to give comfort even to its enemies. The prisoners saw in them the irony of history. They had fought to crush a nation, yet that nation's ordinary life seemed uncrushable. Others found in the memory a lesson about civilization. Not that America was superior, but that strength lay not only in armies but in how a society treated even its outcasts. Civilization was measured not in monuments but in running water. Years later, one former prisoner put it plainly, "The day I flushed a toilet in Texas, I understood that our leaders had lied." He did not mean the toilet itself was decisive, but what it represented, the quiet abundance of a society that had been painted as weak. That revelation marked him more deeply than the battlefields. He carried it through the years, a private emblem of disillusionment. And yet the memory was not only bitter. For many, it became a symbol of hope, proof that life could be different. As Germany rebuilt, as streets were cleared and homes restored, the men who had once flushed toilets in Texas worked to ensure their families would never live without. Plumbing spread, water flowed, and the swirl that had once astonished prisoners became an ordinary sound in German homes. The irony was complete. The lesson of captivity helped shape freedom, but the legacy did not rest only with the Germans. For Americans, too, the story carried weight. Guards remembered how the prisoners reacted, laughing and marveling at what they saw as ordinary. It reminded them that what they took for granted could appear miraculous to others. Some realized that America's quiet strength was not only its weapons, but its way of life, its ability to make dignity commonplace. That realization echoed in memoirs, in lectures, in stories told to children about the war years. Even now, the tale feels almost comic. German soldiers trained to fight in deserts and forests, reduced to awe before a toilet. Yet behind the comedy lies a deeper truth. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are remembered through symbols. For these men, the flush toilet became such a symbol, embodying contradiction, memory, and irony all at once. It reminded them that they had fought for an empire that promised greatness but delivered rubble, while the enemy gave dignity even in captivity. As ships carried them home in 1946, men stood at rails, staring at gray water stretching to the horizon. Some thought of their ruined cities, others of their families waiting in hunger. Yet many strangely thought of the camp washrooms, the gleam of porcelain, the rush of water, the ordinary miracle that had shaken their certainties. It was not the memory they expected to carry, but it was the one that endured. For in that swirl of water they had glimpsed the irony of their war and the legacy of their defeat. And though they did not yet know it, that legacy would ripple outward, shaping not only their memories but the world their children would inherit, proof that even in war, the smallest details could carry the greatest power.